first story, The Goatman of Blackwood. It was a chilly November evening when I decided to visit Blackwood Forest, a remote stretch of woods just outside of Salem, Virginia. I had always loved hiking and had heard about the beauty of the forest's untouched wilderness. But the locals had warned me about something more sinister lurking within. My 10-year-old nephew, Ethan, was visiting for the weekend, and he begged to join me. I hesitated, but his enthusiasm was infectious, so I relented on the condition that we stick close to the marked trails. As we walked deeper into the woods, the air grew thicker, and the sounds of nature seemed to fade away. Ethan chattered excitedly about school and dinosaurs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around dusk, we came across a clearing with a small dilapidated cabin in the center. Ethan was curious, but I felt uneasy and urged him to stay back. The cabin looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades, its wood rotting and windows shattered. But as I peered closer, I noticed something odd about the ground around it. There were hoof-like prints, but too large and too deep to belong to any ordinary animal. Then we heard it. Low, guttural growl echoed from within the cabin. Ethan grabbed my hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear. "Uncle, Jake, what was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the door to the cabin creaked open, and a figure emerged. It stood on two legs, but its body was covered in matted fur. The creature had the twisted features of a man and a goat, with curved horns that gleamed in the dim light. Its eyes were piercing red, and its hands ended in clawed fingers dripping with dark fluid. I pulled Ethan behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature let out a horrible screech and lunged toward us. Grabbing Ethan, ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The forest seemed endless, and the sounds of the creature's pursuit grew closer, just as I thought it would catch us. We burst onto the main road where my truck was parked. I shoved Ethan inside and sped off, leaving Blackwood Forest and its horrors behind. Even now, as sit in my living room with Ethan safe and asleep upstairs, I can't shake the image of that creature from my mind. Was it a demon? A spirit? Or something else entirely? One thing is certain: I will never set foot in Blackwood Forest again. Second story, The Shadows of Hollow Pines. It was an overcast afternoon when my little brother, Charlie, and I decided to explore Hollow Pines Forest just outside of Willow Creek Village. The forest was dense and quiet, except for the soft crackling of leaves beneath our feet. People in the village often spoke about strange occurrences in the woods, but I had always dismissed them as old wives' tales. Charlie held my hand tightly as we walked deeper into the woods. He was only eight years old and usually fearless, but that day he seemed on edge. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. It was not an animal sound I recognized. Something about it felt unnatural. Probably just the wind. "Charlie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But the sound grew louder, closer and more sinister with each passing moment. Suddenly, Charlie froze and pointed toward a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, thin, and barely human in shape. "Run," I yelled, pulling Charlie back toward the village. Branches scratched our faces and arms as we sprinted, but the shadow followed us swiftly and silently. We burst out of the forest and into Willow Creek just as the sun began to set. The streets were eerily empty, and the houses seemed darker than usual. We ran straight to our home and locked the door. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard scratching at the window. Charlie was already asleep in his room, but I could feel something watching me. When I gathered the courage to look, a pair of glowing yellow eyes stared back at me from the darkness outside. The next morning, the village was buzzing with news of disappearances. 2 families on the outskirts had vanished without a trace, their doors wide open and their homes left untouched. We moved out of Willow Creek shortly after, but I still dream of the shadow in Hollow Pines. Sometimes, I wake up to the sound of that guttural noise outside my window. I know it's still watching, and it will never stop. Third story, The Whispers in Black Hollow. It was a crisp autumn morning when I found myself in Black Hollow. This dense forest lay just outside Hillsboro, a quiet town in Oregon. My nephew, Jake, had been missing for 3 days, and the sheriff's department had found no clues. Desperation drove me to search the woods myself. The locals warned me about Black Hollow. They spoke of strange sights and sounds that had kept them away for years. Legends of a watcher that guarded the forest with ruthless intent. But I had to find Jake, even if it meant facing whatever lurked within. The forest was eerily silent as I walked deeper. My footsteps crunched on fallen leaves while the towering pines loomed overhead. After an hour, I noticed something unusual. There were no bird calls, no rustling of wildlife, just an overwhelming sense of being watched. As I ventured farther, I found Jake's backpack, half buried in the dirt. My heart pounded, but before I could call out, a whispering sound froze me in place. It wasn't the wind, but low murmurs that seemed to circle me. I spun around, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. "Uncle," a voice whispered. I turned to see Jake standing a few yards away. His face was pale. His eyes wide and unnatural. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by dread. "Jake," I called out. He didn't move closer but beckoned me with a jerky, unnatural motion. As I approached, the whispering grew louder, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. Suddenly, Jake smiled. It was a horrifying smile that stretched too wide for his small face. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that was not his own. Before I could react, he vanished into the shadows. The whispering became a deafening roar, and I felt a cold presence behind me. I ran. tripping over roots and branches as something chased me with unseen steps. When I finally escaped the woods, I collapsed on the edge of the road. A passing car stopped to help, and I told them what I had seen. But when the sheriff's team searched the forest again, there was no sign of Jake or the backpack. To this day, hear the whispers when I'm alone, calling my name and beckoning me back to Black Hollow